Japan didn't lose the war when its cities burned. It lost it when the trains stopped running. By late 1944, Japanese factories still stood, soldiers still fought, and weapons still existed on paper. But the rail network that fed the entire war effort was collapsing. Coal never reached power plants. Rice never reached cities. Ammunition never reached the front. The empire wasn't defeated by firepower. It was strangled, mile by mile, rail by rail, until nothing could move anymore. By 1944, Japan still looked like a nation at war. Factories were operating. Soldiers were still deployed across China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Weapons were still being produced on paper. From a distance, the system appeared intact. But beneath the surface, the foundation that held everything together was quietly breaking apart. The foundation was the rail network. With almost no domestic oil and limited natural resources, everything that sustained the war, coal, steel, food, ammunition, had to move by rail. Trains carried coal from Kyushu and Hokkaido to power plants. They carried rice from rural regions to cities. They carried weapons and spare parts from factories to ports and garrisons. The railway system was not just transportation, it was circulation. Without it, nothing functioned. American submarines strangled shipping lanes and air raids intensified. Japan was forced to rely even more heavily on its domestic rail network. Coastal shipping declined. Imports vanished. The burden shifted inland. Trains were pushed harder, scheduled tighter, run longer, with less maintenance and fewer spare parts. Locomotives aged rapidly. Tracks degraded. Crews were exhausted. There was no redundancy left. Shortages began to appear, not because coal did not exist, but because it could not be moved efficiently. Power plants received irregular deliveries. Electricity output fluctuated. Factories experienced sudden shutdowns, not from bombing, but from lack of power. Production became erratic. Assembly lines stopped mid-process, then restarted hours or days later. Followed the same path. Rice piled up in rural depots while cities faced shortages. Civilian morale dropped. Workers weakened. Absenteeism rose. The war economy began consuming itself, not from enemy conquest, but from internal paralysis. Japanese leadership focused on defending cities, ports, and factories. They believed that if production sites survived, the war could continue. What they failed to grasp was that production without movement was meaningless. A factory that cannot receive fuel or ship its output is already dead. End of 1944, Japan was not losing because it lacked weapons or manpower. It was losing because nothing could move fast enough or reliably enough to keep the system alive. The trains were slowing, and with them, the empire itself. By early 1945, the collapse was no longer subtle. Japan's rail network was no longer a system, it was a bottleneck under permanent strain. Locomotives sat idle not because they were destroyed, but because there was no fuel to run them, no spare parts to repair them, and no reliable schedules left to follow. Trains that once ran on precise timetables now departed late, arrived unpredictably, or never arrived at all. The problem was coal. Coal powered almost everything in wartime Japan. Electricity generation, steel production, rail transport itself. But coal had to move by rail to reach power plants and factories. As locomotives failed and tracks deteriorated, coal deliveries slowed. Power plants began operating at partial capacity. Electricity was rationed. Factories experienced rolling blackouts that halted production without warning. Created a vicious loop. Less electricity meant fewer industrial outputs. Fewer outputs meant fewer spare parts for railways. Fewer spare parts meant more breakdowns. Each failure fed the next. The system no longer degraded linearly, it cascaded. American bombing worsened the situation, but it was not the root cause. Bombs damaged rail yards, bridges, and switching stations, forcing trains onto longer routes and increasing congestion. Even when damage was repaired, the rail network lacked the resilience to absorb disruption. A single destroyed junction could delay traffic across entire regions. Trains backed up for miles. Freight cars sat loaded but unmoving, blocking other deliveries. Japan attempted emergency measures. Passenger services were cut back to prioritize freight. Civilian travel was restricted. Trains were overloaded beyond safe limits. Maintenance cycles were shortened or skipped entirely. These measures kept traffic moving briefly, but at enormous cost. Equipment wore out faster. Accidents increased. Breakdowns multiplied. At the same time, labor shortages intensified. Experienced railway workers were drafted or killed in air raids. Their replacements were often untrained, exhausted, or malnourished. Mistakes became common. Scheduling errors compounded delays. The rail network lost not just material capacity, but institutional knowledge. Effects spread everywhere. Steel mills received coal too late to maintain continuous production. Ammunition plants missed delivery windows and shut down entire lines. Military units waited weeks for supplies that once took days. Food shipments arrived, spoiled, or never arrived at all. Cities starved while countryside warehouses overflowed. At this stage, Japan still possessed factories, soldiers, and weapons designs. But war had become impossible to sustain because the arteries that fed the body were failing. The empire was not being crushed by a single blow. It was being slowly suffocated. There was no way out. Railways cannot be rebuilt quickly. You cannot manufacture locomotives without steel, electricity, and fuel, all of which depended on the railways themselves. Japan was trapped inside its own logistics collapse. In the spring of 1945, the trains were still running but only just, and every mile they slowed brought the end closer. By the summer of 1945, Japan's rail system was no longer serving the war effort. It was barely serving the nation. Trains still moved, but they moved blindly, without reliable schedules, without coordination, without purpose. The network that once synchronized factories, cities, and military units had fragmented into isolated stretches of track operating on improvised rules. Deliveries collapsed further. Power plants shut down entire sections rather than operate at unsafe levels. Electricity in major cities became sporadic. Factories were forced to choose which machines to run and which to abandon. Production targets existed only on paper. In reality, output was dictated by when the lights happened to be on. Military logistics broke down completely. Units on the mainland and in outlying regions waited for ammunition that never arrived. Artillery sat silent not because shells did not exist, but because trains could not deliver them. Spare parts for vehicles and weapons accumulated in depots far from the front, unreachable through a network that could no longer guarantee movement. Civilian life collapsed alongside the war economy. Urban populations faced acute food shortages. Rice was available in rural areas but could not be transported in sufficient quantities. Malnutrition spread. Workers weakened. Absenteeism surged. Factories lost manpower, just as they lost power and materials. The system was unraveling at every level simultaneously. Japan's leadership still spoke of endurance and sacrifice. Plans were drafted for continued resistance, but these plans assumed movement of food, of fuel, of men. Movement was the one thing the nation no longer controlled. Without trains, the empire had no cohesion. Each region became a semi-isolated pocket, struggling to survive on what it could scavenge locally. The irony was brutal. Japan had invested enormous effort defending its factories and cities from bombing, but the collapse that mattered most did not come from destruction, it came from exhaustion. Steel rails worn thin. Locomotives run beyond repair. Crews pushed past collapse. Systems forced to operate long after their limits had been reached. August 1945, the war was already lost in practical terms. Even without invasion, even without atomic bombs, Japan could no longer feed its cities, power its factories, or supply its forces. The empire still had soldiers willing to fight. What it no longer had was the ability to move anything to where it was needed. Trains had not all stopped, but the war had. By the time Japan surrendered, the rail collapse revealed a truth that was impossible to hide anymore. The war had ended weeks before the surrender announcement. Not in a ceremony, not on a battlefield, but inside timetables that no longer worked, and tracks that no longer connected the nation. The most extreme contingency plans assumed logistics that no longer existed. Plans for mass mobilization of civilians required food distribution. It failed. Plans for final coastal defense required ammunition movement. It failed. Plans for industrial dispersal assumed transportation capacity. That failed too. Strategy had outrun reality. What made the collapse so devastating was its invisibility. There was no single moment when the rail system fell, no dramatic explosion, no decisive strike, just gradual erosion, fewer trains per day, shorter routes, longer delays, more cancellations, until one day, nothing synchronized anymore. Officials began improvising. Factories traded directly with nearby farms. Military units seized supplies without central coordination. Rail managers rerouted trains based on rumor rather than orders. The national system dissolved into survival behavior. Japan stopped functioning as an integrated state and became a collection of disconnected regions. Fragmentation killed any remaining chance of recovery. Modern war requires synchronization. Industry, transport, power, and manpower must move together. Once timing collapses, efficiency collapses. Once efficiency collapses, scale collapses. Japan still had people. It still had factories. But it no longer had timing. Without timing, nothing modern works. Structure holding the empire together. When it failed, everything else followed, not immediately, but inevitably. The war did not end because Japan ran out of courage. It ended because the system that turned effort into action had disintegrated. Japan's defeat was sealed not by bombs alone, but by a nation that could no longer move itself. The final lesson of Japan's rail collapse is the most uncomfortable one, because it strips away every heroic myth about how wars end. It did not lose because it stopped fighting. It lost because effort no longer translated into effect. Soldiers could still march, but ammunition did not follow. Factories could still exist, but materials did not arrive. Farmers could still grow rice, but cities did not receive it. Every part of the system still contained people willing to endure hardship. What vanished was the connective tissue that turned sacrifice into results. This is the point at which wars become unwinnable, regardless of morale. A modern state is not held together by flags or speeches. It is held together by schedules, flows, and coordination. Trains are not just machines, they are time made physical. When trains fail, time itself breaks. Production misses windows, food spoils. Power plants shut down at the wrong hour. Military units arrive too late or not at all. In 1945, Japan had entered a condition where nothing happened when it was supposed to, and in a mechanized war, that is fatal. Atomic bombs did not create this condition, they revealed it. They ended a war that had already collapsed internally. Even without invasion, even without further bombing, Japan could not have continued fighting in any meaningful way. The rail system, the last mechanism capable of moving energy, food, and force across the islands, was exhausted beyond recovery. That's why surrender followed so quickly. Not because leaders suddenly lost resolve, but because there was nothing left to command. Orders without logistics are just words. Courage without movement is just suffering. Japan's rail collapse teaches a lesson that applies far beyond World War II. Systems fail long before symbols fall. By the time a nation appears defeated, the real defeat has already occurred quietly, inside infrastructure no one talks about. Wars do not end when armies stop fighting. They end when systems stop working. And once the trains could no longer run, Japan's war was already over. In the end, Japan's defeat was not the result of a single catastrophic moment. It was the outcome of a system that quietly stopped functioning long before the flag was lowered. The rail collapse did not announce itself with explosions or surrender documents. It revealed itself in delays, shortages, missed connections, and silence. Silence mattered. Decided by who is willing to suffer the most. It is decided by who can still move. Movement is what turns intention into action. Without it, courage becomes static, planning becomes fiction, authority becomes noise. And still had soldiers willing to fight. It still had officers issuing orders. It still had factories listed on production charts. But by 1945, none of those elements could be synchronized. The trains that once aligned time, space, and effort had lost their ability to do so. And once synchronization was gone, the war ceased to be winnable in any meaningful sense. What makes the rail collapse so important and so often overlooked. Histories tend to focus on visible destruction, bombed cities, sunken ships, shattered armies. But systems rarely die in public. They die in back offices, dispatch rooms, maintenance depots, and scheduling charts. They die when the margin for error disappears. Japan's rail network was built for growth, not exhaustion. It was designed to support commerce, urbanization, and industry, not a prolonged total war under blockade, bombing, labor loss, and material scarcity. When pressure mounted, it adapted. When pressure intensified, it strained. When pressure became constant, it broke. It broke, everything depending on it broke too. Factories without fuel became warehouses. Power plants without coal became shells. Cities without food became liabilities. Military units without resupply became irrelevant. None of these failures required enemy troops to arrive. They unfolded internally, driven by friction and fatigue. This is the uncomfortable truth modern nations prefer not to confront. Defeat can occur without collapse at the front. A state can lose while still fighting. It can surrender after it has already been functionally defeated. Rail collapse also exposes a deeper illusion, one that persists far beyond World War II. The illusion that endurance alone wins wars. Japan endured. Its population suffered. Its soldiers held positions under impossible conditions. But endurance without infrastructure is just prolonged failure. Wars are not tests of suffering. They are tests of systems. And systems fail when they are asked to do more than they were built to sustain. Japan's leaders believed that protecting factories and cities was enough. They underestimated the importance of flow. They assumed production mattered more than movement. In reality, movement is what makes production meaningful. A factory that cannot receive inputs or deliver outputs is already dead, even if its walls still stand. Time surrender came. Japan was no longer a coordinated war machine. It was a collection of isolated regions, each struggling to survive on diminishing resources. Central authority existed on paper, but not in practice. Orders could be issued, but not executed. Strategy could be discussed, but not implemented. This is the point at which wars end, not ceremonially, but structurally. The atomic bombs did not cause this collapse. They arrived at the end of it. They closed a chapter that had already run out of pages. Even without them, Japan could not have sustained large-scale operations much longer. The rail system could not be repaired fast enough. The locomotives could not be replaced. The skilled labor could not be restored. Time had run out. It does not diminish the tragedy of those final months. It explains them. And it offers a lesson that extends far beyond history. Dependent on movement than ever before. Energy, food, data, and materials flow through systems that are efficient but fragile. They work beautifully until they don't. When they fail, the collapse is rarely dramatic at first. It is quiet, incremental, dismissed as temporary. Well, it isn't. Collapse reminds us that power is not just about strength, numbers, or resolve. It is about coordination over time. It is about maintaining the invisible machinery that makes action possible. When that machinery fails, everything else becomes theater. The war ended when the trains could no longer hold the nation together. Not when the last shot was fired, not when the surrender was signed, but when movement itself became impossible. That is how modern wars truly end. When people try to explain why Japan lost the war, they usually point to moments of shock. The fall of Saipan, the firebombing of Tokyo, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. These events feel decisive because they are visible, violent, and emotionally overwhelming. But history is rarely decided by moments alone. It is decided by processes. Japan's rail collapse was not a moment. It was a process that unfolded in plain sight, yet remained misunderstood until it was irreversible. What failed was not simply transportation. What failed was coordination. A modern nation exists only as long as it can synchronize time, space, and effort. Railways are the mechanism that performs this synchronization. They align factories with power plants, farms with cities, ports with industries, soldiers with supplies. Once that alignment fails, the nation ceases to function as a single entity. In 1945, Japan still existed politically, militarily, and symbolically. But functionally, it no longer existed as an integrated system. The empire had fractured into disconnected zones, each operating on partial information, local improvisation, and diminishing resources. Central authority could still speak, but it could no longer move. Distinction matters because modern power is not stored, it flows. When flow is interrupted, power does not slowly weaken, it collapses in uneven, unpredictable ways. Some areas continue functioning briefly, others fail immediately. The illusion of survival persists until synchronization is gone everywhere. Japan crossed that threshold before the war officially ended. The rail system had once been Japan's greatest advantage. It enabled rapid industrialization, urban growth, and military expansion. But that same system became a trap under total war. Built for efficiency, it lacked resilience. Built for growth, it lacked endurance. Built for peace, it was never meant to absorb constant damage, neglect, and overload. This is the paradox of modern infrastructure. The more optimized it is, the less forgiving it becomes. Pressure mounted, Japan attempted to preserve appearances. Trains still ran, schedules were still published, reports were still filed. But beneath those rituals, reality diverged. Freight cars were delayed indefinitely. Coal arrived too late to matter. Food spoiled en route. Military shipments missed windows that could never be reopened. Divergence between appearance and function is one of the most dangerous phases of systemic collapse. Leaders see activity and assume capability. They see motion and assume control. But activity without coordination is just noise. Japan's leadership did not understand this in time. For capacity, they believed sacrifice could substitute for logistics. They believed spirit could compensate for movement. These beliefs were not unique to Japan, but they were especially lethal in a war defined by mechanization and scale. Collapse exposed the hard boundary between human will and physical systems. People can endure hunger. Machines cannot. People can improvise. Schedules cannot. People can be inspired. Coal cannot move itself. At some point, the burden placed on systems exceeds what they can absorb. When that happens, no amount of loyalty, or courage can reverse the outcome. This is why the end came so suddenly once surrender was announced. From the outside, it appeared abrupt. From the inside, it was overdue. The state had been operating on inertia for months. Orders were issued because issuing orders was expected, not because execution was possible. In a sense, Japan's defeat was not a collapse of resistance, but a collapse of conversion. The nation could no longer convert effort into effect. That is the true definition of defeat in modern war. You are defeated not when you stop fighting, but when fighting no longer changes outcomes. Japan reached that point when trains stopped being reliable. When railways lost timing, everything downstream lost meaning. Production targets became irrelevant. Defensive plans became theoretical. Even survival became localized and unequal. The empire did not fall as a single structure, it dissolved. This reframes how we should think about modern conflict. Wars are often described as contests of strength, but they are more accurately contests of sustainability. The side that can maintain synchronized flow longest wins, not the side that strikes hardest or endures most pain. Japan endured immense pain. It did not endure synchronization. There is a temptation to treat this story as uniquely Japanese, rooted in geography, culture, or wartime circumstances. That would be a mistake. The lesson is universal. Any society that depends on high-throughput systems is vulnerable to the same failure mode. Modern states are even more exposed than Japan was. Energy grids, supply chains, digital networks, and transportation systems operate with extraordinary efficiency and minimal slack. They function beautifully under normal conditions. Under sustained stress, they fail in exactly the same way Japan's rail network did. Gradually, quietly, then all at once. This is why infrastructure is rarely discussed honestly. It lacks drama, it lacks heroes, it lacks symbolism, but it determines outcomes. Japan did not lose because it misjudged a battle. It lost because it misjudged what kind of war it was fighting. It treated modern war as a moral struggle, when it was also a logistical one. It protected factories, but neglected flow. It defended territory, but ignored timing. When timing collapsed, everything else followed. The surrender, when it came, was not the end of resistance. It was the acknowledgement of reality. A reality in which trains could no longer sustain cities, armies, or industry. A reality in which the nation had already fragmented beneath the surface. This is why the war ended not with a final clash, but with a decision. There was nothing left to coordinate. It reminds us that history is shaped less by moments of destruction than by moments of exhaustion. Systems do not fail because they are attacked once. They fail because they are asked to perform beyond their limits for too long. When those limits are crossed, collapse does not need an enemy to finish it. It finishes itself. This war truly ended not in fire, not in surrender, but in the slow, silent breakdown of the system that once held everything together. If Japan's rail collapse teaches anything, it is that modern war is not a contest of destruction, but a contest of continuity. Victory does not belong to the side that can destroy the most, but to the side that can keep things moving the longest. And by 1945, Japan had lost continuity. Our economy did not end with a bang. It thinned, it slowed, it fragmented, and then it ceased to behave like a system at all. First, the changes were subtle. Freight trains arrived late. Power plants adjusted schedules. Factories worked around interruptions. Each disruption seemed manageable on its own, but modern systems are not damaged by single failures. They are damaged by accumulation. Every delay consumed margin. Every workaround replaced structure. Every emergency fix became the new normal. Eventually, there was no normal left. Structure capable of imposing order on chaos. It connected resources to production, production to distribution, distribution to survival. Once it failed, nothing could enforce coherence across the nation. Regions began operating on local logic. What worked in one prefecture failed in another. The idea of a national war effort became abstract. This is how systems die, not through annihilation, but through loss of shared timing. A factory without materials is not broken. It is disconnected. A city without food is not defeated. It is isolated. An army without resupply is not destroyed. It is irrelevant. Japan reached a point where disconnection was the dominant condition. From that moment on, the war existed only as inertia. One of the most dangerous myths about war is that collapse must look dramatic. In reality, collapse often looks bureaucratic. Reports continue to be written. Orders continue to circulate. Schedules continue to exist long after they stop meaning anything. Japan's rail system continued to be managed on paper even as it failed in reality. This gap between documentation and function widened daily. And once that gap exists, decision-making becomes detached from consequences. Leaders react to symbols rather than conditions. It is not a uniquely Japanese failure. It is a systemic failure common to all complex organizations under prolonged stress. Another overlooked lesson is that modern warfare punishes dependence on speed. Japan's industrial system had been built for rapid expansion and efficient flow. It worked extraordinarily well when inputs were reliable, but speed amplifies fragility. When disruption occurs, faster systems break harder. Slow systems degrade gradually. Fast systems shatter. By 1944, Japan's rail network had no buffer time. Trains ran edge to edge. There was no slack in schedules, no spare locomotives, no excess crews, no stockpiled fuel near points of use. Any disruption propagated immediately across the system. It meant that recovery was impossible. Even when damage was repaired, the system could not stabilize. Every fix triggered new failures elsewhere. The network entered a state of permanent imbalance. In such a condition, leadership loses agency. Decisions no longer shape outcomes. They respond to them. Strategy becomes theater. The war continues because stopping it requires admitting what has already happened. And did not lack intelligence, it lacked reversibility. Once rail degradation reached a certain point, there was no path back to stability. Locomotives could not be rebuilt fast enough. Skilled workers could not be trained fast enough. Coal could not be repositioned fast enough. Even if bombing had stopped, the collapse would have continued. This is the true meaning of systemic failure, when removing the stressor does not restore function. Japan's rail collapse had crossed that threshold before the war ended. Another crucial lesson lies in the difference between control and influence. Governments often believe that issuing orders means exercising control, but control exists only when systems can comply. When rail schedules no longer align with physical reality, orders become suggestions. When power distribution becomes improvisation, authority becomes symbolic. Japan reached a point where the state could no longer enforce its own priorities. Military needs competed with civilian survival. Industrial output competed with food transport. No hierarchy could resolve those conflicts because the underlying capacity no longer existed. This is the moment when a state stops being a machine and becomes a crowd. And crowds cannot fight industrial wars. In this collapse, though it is rarely discussed, suffering alone does not produce strength. In fact, prolonged suffering without progress erodes capability. Workers weaken. Judgment declines. Errors multiply. Systems depend on human precision. Exhaustion degrades precision long before it breaks will. In 1945, Japan's rail system was operated by people who were hungry, overworked, undertrained, and traumatized. Even if equipment had survived, performance could not. Human systems have limits too. Our economy did not fail because people stopped trying. It failed because trying harder accelerated breakdown. This is a hard truth, and one modern societies resist. Effort does not scale infinitely. At some point, increased effort produces negative returns. And cross that point. Was not a sudden decision forced by external shock. It was an acknowledgement that the nation could no longer act as a coordinated whole. It could endure suffering, but it could not convert that suffering into military effect. Distinction matters. As loss of territory or destruction of forces. But Japan lost something more fundamental, the ability to act collectively in time. Trains were the clock of the nation. When they stopped keeping time, everything drifted out of alignment. Without alignment, power dissolves. That's why modern war is decided long before the final battle. It is decided in maintenance schedules, spare parts inventories, crew rotations, fuel stockpiles, and infrastructure redundancy. It is decided by whether systems are designed to survive exhaustion. Japan's were not. The victors or condemn the defeated. It explains outcomes. It shows that wars are won not only by what is built, but by what is preserved, not by what is maximized, but by what is sustained. Japan built an empire faster than it could maintain it. Empire unraveled not violently, but completely. Or ended not because Japan stopped believing, but because the nation stopped moving as one. That's how modern wars truly end. If there is one concept that explains Japan's defeat better than firepower or morale, it is entropy. Not destruction, not collapse in the dramatic sense, but the gradual loss of order in a system that once depended on precision. War is not chaos, it is coordination. It requires exact timing, predictable flows, and repeatable outcomes. Railways exist to defeat entropy. They impose order on geography, they compress distance. They synchronize millions of individual actions into a single national rhythm. Japan's war ended when that rhythm could no longer be maintained. At the beginning of the conflict, Japan's rail system was a triumph of organization. Trains ran on tight schedules. Freight moved with remarkable efficiency. Industrial centers were tightly coupled to resource regions. Time itself was disciplined. Every delay had meaning. Every disruption had a solution. Total war increases entropy faster than peacetime systems are designed to absorb. Bombing damaged tracks. Labor shortages thinned maintenance crews. Fuel scarcity disrupted schedules. Each factor alone was survivable. Together, they accelerated disorder. Repairs took longer. Workarounds became permanent. Temporary deviations became standard practice. Began to decay. Itself as failure. It appeared as improvisation. Trains were rerouted. Loads were combined. Schedules were adjusted. On the surface, the system still functioned. But beneath that surface, predictability was vanishing. And without predictability, coordination collapses. A factory that receives coal at irregular intervals cannot plan output. A city that receives food unpredictably cannot distribute it fairly. A military unit that receives ammunition late cannot time operations. Every disruption multiplied uncertainty downstream. Entropy spreads outward. Japan's rail system was no longer enforcing order, it was reacting to disorder. That distinction matters. A system that reacts is already behind. It is consuming energy simply to prevent collapse, not to achieve objectives. This is the hidden cost of entropy. Effort shifts from progress to survival. Japan reached a point where its rail network absorbed more effort than it delivered. Crews worked longer hours to move less freight. Maintenance consumed more labor to restore less reliability. The system entered negative productivity not because people stopped working, but because disorder consumed their output. At that stage, recovery becomes impossible. It requires excess capacity, redundancy, and time, all of which Japan lacked. Every attempt to impose order generated new disorder elsewhere. Tightening schedules increased breakdowns. Overloading trains accelerated wear. Cutting civilian transport undermined labor availability. The system fought itself. Japan's war effort did not collapse evenly. Some regions still functioned. Others failed catastrophically. This unevenness created the illusion of survivability. As long as some trains ran, leaders believed the system endured. But systems do not fail when the last component stops. They fail when coordination can no longer be restored. And cross that threshold silently. Precision became its weakness. High-precision systems demand stable inputs. Once inputs fluctuate, precision amplifies error. Small delays propagate. Minor misalignments magnify. Feedback loops turn corrective actions into accelerants of failure. P accelerates. Collapse felt sudden at the end. From within the system, collapse had been ongoing for months. From outside, it appeared abrupt. Observers saw trains running until suddenly they no longer mattered. History often mistakes visibility for causation. The surrender did not cause the collapse. The collapse made surrender inevitable. By the time political decisions were debated, the material conditions required to continue fighting no longer existed. The nation could still imagine resistance, but imagination had replaced execution. The war existed in rhetoric, not in movement. Distinction between symbolic power and functional power is critical. Japan retained symbols of sovereignty until the end. Flags flew, commands were issued, institutions existed. But sovereignty without logistics is ceremonial. Authority without synchronization is hollow. Power that cannot move is no power at all. Rail collapse stripped the state of its ability to act as a unit. Decisions fragmented, regions improvised. The national timeline dissolved into local crises. Time itself stopped being shared. A nation without shared time cannot wage modern war. Conflict felt surreal. Events occurred without sequence, shortages appeared randomly, factories shut down unpredictably, nothing aligned. The war lost its narrative because the system that structured narrative movement was gone. Japan's defeat was not a loss of territory, it was a loss of temporal control. And this is the most dangerous form of defeat because it is invisible until complete. There is a temptation to see this outcome as inevitable given Japan's resources. But inevitability is misleading. Outcomes emerge from choices interacting with limits. Japan chose efficiency over resilience, speed over slack, precision over redundancy. Choices produced rapid expansion and rapid exhaustion. Modern systems reward these choices initially. They punish them eventually. The rail collapse is therefore not a Japanese story. It is a systems story. Any society that builds for maximum throughput without buffer builds collapse into its future. P always wins without resistance. The Allies resisted entropy by overbuilding, by accepting inefficiency, by maintaining slack. Their systems absorbed disorder without losing coordination. Japan's did not. Difference decided the war long before the final days. When historians focus on dramatic endings, they miss the deeper truth. Wars are not decided by peaks. They are decided by decay, by how long order can be maintained under pressure. Japan lost when its railways could no longer impose order on chaos. Not when bombs fell, not when armies advanced, but when time itself slipped out of alignment. That is how modern wars end, not in fire, but in disorder. No victory is possible